Well, benedicite Dominus, and welcome to question 44 of the Secunda Secundae. The topic for this lecture is the precepts of charity, and I am Dr. Thibault. So we are looking at 8 different articles this time. We are approaching the end of charity. So the first question is it appropriate to have precepts for charity? This is kind of a fun one. So, if you're saying charity is love, right? Do you need to have laws that tell you to love, right? Is it contrary to have a law to love? And St. Thomas points out that there's nothing which is required, which is not also a precept. So the Lord has required us to love, therefore it must be a precept. So looking at Matthew 22, the commandment is, thou shalt, right? That's a command, an imperative statement. Love the Lord your God with your whole heart and with your whole soul and with your whole mind, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, that is the greatest command, right? And the two greatest commands boiled into one. Right, so this, because it is a command, it is a law. It is a divine law set out by Christ and also found within the Old Testament as well, right? Within Deuteronomy. Another point of this would be from 1 Timothy. The end of the commandment is charity from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and an unfeigned faith. And when we break this down, right, we can say a pure heart, which is the love of God for God's own sake, right? That's part of the divine law, is to love God for God's own sake. Another one is in terms of having a good conscience. Right? If you don't have a good conscience, then you don't fear hell appropriately. Some people might fear hell inordinately, right? Everything they see is the devil, right? That would be not a sign of a good conscience. At the same time, if you don't fear hell at all, or God's judgment, then that's not a good conscience either, right? You should rejoice in God's justice and pray for God's mercy, right? This would be a sign of a good conscience. And also an unfeigned faith is important, which is to believe the true things, right? You don't want any false teaching, right? This kind of goes in with a good conscience. The good conscience deals with it morally, and the unfeigned faith deals with it in terms of the intellect, right? So the good conscience is more of the will, and the unfeigned faith is more of the intellect. But this is that we believe the right things, right? So the heart, the actions, the appetites, and the intellect, right? These are the elements of this. So when we look at, is it appropriate for there to be 2 precepts? This is one of the questions. So St. Thomas says, yes, there is, charity is one virtue, but there are 2 acts. Well, what are the 2 acts? Love of God and love of neighbor, right? These are the 2 acts. Right? So when you love God in one way, this is one act. So if you go to Mass, go to adoration, right? This could be something, but then if you leave adoration on your way out, you are honking your horn and screaming at the people on the road, you didn't love your neighbor, right? So you have to both love God and neighbor. Now, if you love God in your neighbor, they can be combined, but these are considered 2 different acts, right, of one virtue. Now, are 2 precepts sufficient? Now, this is where he brings up St. Augustine's 4 views of love, which we talk about a lot, these 4, but it's that you love God first, then you love yourself, then you love your neighbor, and then you love your own body, right? In that order, those 4. So, because love of God is properly fitting, right? And then it's most natural to love yourself, right? And then you love your neighbor as yourself. First, you have to love yourself, right? So in the proper order. And then lastly, you should consider your own body, but your neighbor's soul, which is eternal, is more important than your body, which is mortal, right? So it's to put the eternal above the mortal. And St. Thomas, when he's looking at these 4 loves, he said, well, why are there only 2 loves, love of God and love of neighbor? How about love of self and love of body, right? It seems insufficient, right? Clearly, St. Thomas is not going to say that the scriptures are insufficient, but his reason why is that charity is a kind of friendship, right? Friendship is between 2 or more people, right? I mentioned this earlier in charity, where somebody, a psychologist, told me, you have to have a good, have a good relationship with yourself. Right? How do you have a relationship with yourself? Isn't the idea of a relationship that it's with somebody else? He looked at me funny, like I was out of my mind for saying, don't you have to have a relationship with someone else? And I looked at him funny, right? We were looking at each other funny, like I think we misunderstand each other. But that's the difference between a theologian and a psychologist. But St. Thomas would agree with me that a friendship is between 2 or more. Therefore, love of self is not a precept, and love of your body is not a precept in the same way. They can be drawn into it through the divine precept of love of God and love of self. Now, should we love with our whole heart? Now, that seems quite like a silly thing to ask, since it's right. You shall love the Lord your God with your whole heart, right? This is Deuteronomy 6. It's also from Matthew that we just cited, right? You love your God with your whole heart. Now, St. Thomas gives 2 reasons why you should love God with your whole heart. One is that so that the whole heart, if you are loving God with your whole heart, then all of your heart, right, 100% of your heart is directed at God, right? So if your whole heart is directed at God, then your attention is directed at God, which is fitting, right? So it's fitting for you, all of your love to be directed at God. Now, the second is very similar to the first, but it's in terms of the habit of consistently directing our hearts towards God, right? This is a very human thing, right? Because number one, that first one, we cannot actually fully direct our whole heart towards God in this life because, well, there's other things that we want and need, right? So I can say I fully direct my heart towards God. Sometimes I really would love to go to sleep, or I'm really hungry, or there's something else, right? There's other things in the world which take my mind off of the direct love of God in this life. In heaven, that those don't exist, right? So the habit part is that we are constantly redirecting our heart towards God. So when we try to love God with our whole heart, but then I start thinking about food, and then when we use this as a practice, right, as a habit, then I say, okay, I've eaten, redirect, right? Okay, I've slept, redirect, right? It's constantly redirecting one's heart towards God, which is a practice, which is a virtue, which is a habit, right? It's all going together, right? And it's moving us in some ways to a greater love, right? This is a good spiritual point, right? If you get distracted in prayer or something like that, well, isn't there something loving about, let's say you go to holy hour and in 1 hour you're distracted 60 times, right? Every minute you get distracted. And 60 times in that hour, you redirect your attention on the love of God. Well, every time you redirected your mind back to the love of God, you have practiced, you have engaged in habitus, right? You are in the habit of directing your mind towards God, which is loving, right? Redirecting your mind towards God 60 times is better than redirecting your mind towards God once, right? Not literally, but you get the idea. If something is difficult to do and you keep trying, there's more virtue in it than when you just do it and it comes easy, right? That's true, right? So it's a good holy practice, right? Now, if we consider venial sin, does not cut off the whole heart from loving God. So somebody could fully, wholly love God, right? Constantly directing their minds towards God and be in venial sin, right? Have a venial sin. Because venial sin might be a hindrance to charity, but it does not kill charity. Unlike mortal sin, which is contrary to charity, right? So you're in mortal sin, you are going in the opposite direction of charity. Right? It's the opposite of charity, mortal sin. So you can't be in mortal sin and wholly loving, because that act of charity is, again, undone by the act of mortal sin. It's like being faithful while committing adultery. Well, you can't, right? Because adultery is the opposite of faithful, right? So, but you could say, well, what if you forgot your wife's anniversary? Well, you could still love your wife and forget your anniversary, right? But you can't be faithful if you're committing adultery, right? Because that's the opposite. Now, how about, and with your whole mind and your whole soul, and with all of your strength, right? As the saying goes. St. Thomas points out that there are many versions of this, right? You can look at the different Gospels. They have different wording. You can look at different sections of the Old Testament and New Testament where we're talking about loving your God with your whole mind, your whole soul, your whole strength, all your might, for example, with all your force. There's different words we can use, but St. Thomas, and he looks at all of these, right? But he says we're really talking about the same thing, right? We're talking about all of yourself, right? Everything, and it makes sense to say this, right? Mind, heart, soul, strength. He says what we're really talking about is a unity, right? We're talking about the intellect. We're talking about the appetites. We're talking about the will, right? With all your stomach, right? With all of your mind, with all of your body, right? With your intellect and your will, right? All of you is directing it towards the love of God, right? So it's not really redundant. It's unitive in some ways, right? Moving towards the end, number 6. Is it possible to fulfill this precept of love of God and love of neighbor? Is it possible to fulfill it, right? Is to do it perfectly? And this is very similar to question 28, just 20 questions earlier, when we were talking about peace. If we look at Article 2, very similar, right? Can you have perfect peace on earth within yourself, or imperfect? Same concept, same reasoning. What St. Thomas says is perfectly you cannot. Not in this life. You cannot have perfect peace in this life. You cannot have perfect love in this life, perfect charity in this life. You can only do it imperfectly, right? Why? For the same reasons I just gave recently, right? You could say, I love God with my whole mind, I'm hungry, right? I have to go to the bathroom. I'm tired. I have to go to work. Right? You have to take care of your children, right? All of these different things that happen redirect the mind from the total latria, right? Adoration of God. So it's like, well, love God with your whole being, right? 100%. Well, you can't direct 100% towards God, right? Some of it has to go to neighbor because we live in the world where we depend on one another, right? Even a hermit depends on someone else. So we only do it imperfectly, which St. Thomas pointed out with peace is perfectly fine, right? It's not you're not a failure because you don't perfectly love God, and he points out in this section as well with like a military person, right? If you follow your orders in the military, but ultimately you are unsuccessful, it's not your fault, right? As long as you did what you were supposed to do, the battle might still be unsuccessful. However, you did your job as a soldier, right? If you did what you were asked to do, right? So same thing with this example, right? We can do what we're supposed to do, don't commit any mortal sins, love God to the best of your ability. But if you have a family, you have a job, you have all these other things going on, don't commit a mortal sin, but but love to the best of your ability, and that's all that is required, right? It's not required that you love God perfectly, so long as you love God, right? You don't have to love your neighbor perfectly, just love your neighbor and don't commit mortal sins. That's the point. It's kind of a nice line here, so I included it. Hence the precept will be observed fully and perfectly in heaven, yet it is fulfilled through imperfect on the way. Nevertheless, the way one man will fulfill it is more perfectly than another, and so much more as he approaches by some kind of likeness to the perfection of heaven. Right. So some people will do it better than others, and we're on the journey, but the perfection really comes in heaven. Right. Mother Teresa might be at a 99%, and I am at a 20%. Right. In terms of that love, but we're on the journey, right? We're not excluded because we have not perfectly loved, so long as we are loving, right? Is this command, right, the precepts, fittingly expressed, right? That to love your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. Is this properly, fittingly expressed? And St. Thomas, well, he's not going to say that the Lord is wrong when he says this, right? And it's all throughout the Old and New Testament. He's not going to say it's wrong. And he says it's right for two reasons. One is in terms of reason, right? Love of neighbor, right? Is why should we love our neighbor? He says in terms of neighbor, it should be expressed. Why? Because your neighbor is your friend, right? Your neighbor is somebody who is in close proximity to you, right? It's like, is it proper? What is the reason for loving your child? Well, because they are your child, right? Because of the relationship between parent and child, the love is natural. Right? It's a natural love that comes out of the relationship between parent and child. It is a natural relationship that comes out of the relationship between neighbors, right? It's like calling them, your brothers and sisters, right? Why should you care about your brothers and sisters? Because they're your brothers and sisters. By almost by definition, that's true, right? Secondly, in terms of mode, right? Is it physically expressed to love your God with your whole heart and love your neighbor as yourself? And St. Thomas again says, yes, the mode of loving your neighbor is as oneself, right? That's how we love our neighbor, as oneself. That's the mode. Now this can be broken down in three ways, he then says. He says, we love our neighbor as oneself for God's sake, right? Because God has asked us to do this, right? Charity is this loving of God for God's own sake, abiding in God, enjoying God, friendship with God, and from this friendship comes love of neighbor, right? So we love our neighbor not for their own sake, but because of God's sake. We love our neighbor, right? If we were to love our neighbor for their own sake, right? If we were to love our neighbor because our neighbor is good, nice, friendly, right? This would be philia, or because we are interested in marrying our neighbor, right? In terms of eros, right? So there's different ways we can love our neighbor, but if we love our neighbor for the sake of God, that's an extension of charity, right? To love our... This is right from this section of Matthew, right? To love your God with your whole mind, body, soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. This is an extension of the love of God, right? It's for the sake of God, right? In terms of the rule of love, St. Thomas calls it, you would not do evil to your neighbor, right? So in terms of justice, to do good and to avoid evil, right? So if you love your neighbor, you do not do evil to your neighbor, right? So that's part of the rule of love. And the reason, again, number 3, would be for the reason of loving, right? To love them for their own sake, right? Or for the sake of God, but not for your sake. That's the key, right? You could say, we love my neighbor for the sake of God. I love my neighbor for their own sake, but not because of what they provide for me, right? This would be part of philia again, where, well, I choose this person to be my friend because they have good virtues, because they add joy to my life, right? That's why I might pick a friend, right? That's because it does something for me, right? To love them for their own sake, or for the sake of God, is the most fitting mode of charity, right? It's the fitting mode of charity. Other types of love, but in terms of charity, that's what's fitting. To love your neighbor for their own sake, right? To love them as another self, even, right? Lastly, should there be a proper ordering to charity? And the answer for this is yes, right? So going back to the 4 examples before, now St. Thomas doesn't name this section from St. Augustine again, but it's obvious that this is what he's talking about. So again, what's the proper order of charity? Love of God, number 1. God is the most good, therefore God is most fittingly lovable. So God is most fittingly lovable and the object of charity. Next, most naturally, would be love of oneself. Right? Because God is not perverse. He's very fine with you loving yourself. Right? Next, you love your neighbor as yourself. Right? And then you love your body, but after you love of neighbor, because love of self and love of neighbor deals with an eternal life and eternal happiness. Love of body is it's a mortal body, and you should take care of your body, but it's not as important as the eternal soul of your neighbor, right? And St. Thomas also kind of points to other ordering as well, that you would love those who are closest to you first, right? This is very contrary to the Enlightenment philosophers, Bentham, Mill, Kant, who think that we should be impartial, right? Equal, universal. Ideas of the Enlightenment. This isn't true of this kind of virtue approach, which says, oh, you have to love those closest to you first, right? So, with your spouse, your children, your parents, people who live in your house, right? Your neighbors, your friends, right? Kind of this love extends to the whole world, but it originates in an inner circle and it moves out, right? So love of God, love of self, and then the circle keeps getting bigger. This is a proper ordering of love, right? We talked about this before. Now I forget which question. Beneficence, I believe it was. It was in the external acts of charity, right? Yeah, you should love, if there's an earthquake in Haiti, right, extraordinary circumstance, then maybe you don't make the donation to your local food pantry this week and you give it to an earthquake fund in Haiti, because if somebody goes without in your state, maybe they go a little bit hungry, the money in Haiti would save a life, right? So in terms of an emergency, sometimes you have to step over the people who are right in front of you to help somebody further away in extraordinary circumstances. But in general, you do not step over the people right in front of you in order to help somebody far away, right? That's kind of the natural order. St. Thomas looks at this in the form of justice, right? It would be unjust to love somebody else's child more than you love your own child, right? This would be perverse, right? It would be an injustice. It would be unjust to let your own child starve in order to save somebody else's child. Right? That might sound cruel to you, because we have grown up in the age of the Enlightenment where we are supposed to treat everybody equally and impartially. But this is not the world that St. Thomas is living in, where, ideally everyone is fed. Right? But if we each start from our center and we move out, that will happen, given there's not extraordinary crises, in which case we should then violate that kind of rule and reach out in that specific way. So the order determines the right actions, right? So by going in the right order, you determine right actions and justice. Okay, so in conclusions, there are precepts to charity. Anything that is required is a precept. There's a precept. The two precepts are love of God and love of neighbor. That's enough, right? Love of your own body, love of yourself. This is an extension of love of God and love of neighbor. You love God with your whole heart. That's perfectly fitting, as you could imagine. Then you should also love God with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength, right? This is an extension of our intellect and will, right? This is an extension of the whole person, right? With all of you. That's what it's saying. We don't do it perfectly in this life, right? We never are quite living in perfect states of charity. Some are closer than others, but none of us are perfect in our charity in this life, right? It's for the next. Doesn't mean we give up, right? Perfectly fine to be an imperfect person of charity as long as we are loving, right? It is fitting to love our neighbor, kind of an obvious thing, and we should do it in the proper order, right? By doing it in the hierarchy of charity, we then act justly and according to the precepts, and it's most fitting, right? It's fitting. So that is it, and next we will move on to a gift of charity. Okay, have a great day.